All right, we're recording the session now. That's great. Okay. So this session will be available later as well to watch as a video should you like to do so. All right, so let's get started. All right, so this is a brief overview of the changes from APA 6.0 to APA 7.0. APA does this probably every like 7 years. It's like the katydids when they come up every 17 or 15 years. APA comes out with a new manual and just messes everybody's world up. But as long as you're staying on top of APA, it's sometimes not that bad. This time, I think it is, they have made it easier. There's certainly a lot more examples in the current APA manual. So that's going to be a big help when it comes to trying to figure out how do you reference a chat from a video that you watched in a YouTube. You know, those kind of things are now going to be much more transparent. So that's a good thing. Okay, so hold on, I'm just going to admit some more people. They're piling up out there. We know how everybody likes to make an entrance. Okay. All right. Okay, so just for people who are here who are doctoral students, we have both faculty, we have doctoral students, we have master's students in here as well. Some of this information may be applicable to the dissertation students, but most of it is going to be general. So you may see me refer time to time to dissertation students, but for the most part, this is supposed to be for everyone. So please enjoy. If you plan to defend your dissertation after the spring, it must be formatted in APA 7.0. Our editors, the Hartful editor, which works really closely with CityU, has already gotten up to speed with APA 7.0, so we are good to go when it comes to that. So thank goodness. Okay, now we do have templates, and as many of you know, I do not like to use templates. I believe that templates create more drama than they solve, but we have them available. What you should do instead of using a template is learn to use Microsoft Styles, because styles are what set all of the fonts and formats and things for your paper. And if you don't use styles, then you kind of leave your paper open sometimes. If you've ever given a paper to your professor and the professor says the formatting is wrong and you're like, but on my computer it's right. Well, that's because your computer is showing you the normal style or the default style, and the professor has a different default style on their computer. If you don't set styles, and this is my soapbox, I promise there won't be many of these, but if you don't set styles, you're not going to have any control over your work. So these student paper and dissertation templates are set to the correct styles. However, if you type things in the wrong place and you're not aware of what styles are, you can quickly lose that and make it a mess. So keep in mind, templates are not a panacea. Just because you're using one doesn't mean it solves all of your problems, but it can help. And so we have a student paper template for APA 7.0, and that is located in the library website. And we also have a dissertation template, and you'll get that once you have access to the dissertation shell, which you will get access to once you start the dissertation process. So that is available for you once you're in the dissertation process. Okay, so I'm going to note some big changes, and then we're going to go over some a little bit of more detail, and then I'm going to show you a sample paper, and then we're going to talk about how the APA manual is organized and the changes that you can see in that reorganization or what you can see in the manual from that. And so unfortunately for all of you who click twice for spaces like myself, APA has finally decided that one space is the way of the world, so we have to adapt, and one space it is. Just do a find and replace for dot space space and change it to dot space, and you've reconstructed your paper to a single space after punctuation. And that's true after any punctuation as well as the period, so keep that in mind. In order to be more inclusive and to follow what is really going on in the world today, APA has adopted the use of they, them, their as singular neutral pronouns. So instead of saying he or she, you can say they, their, them to refer to one person. This is helpful, for example, if you don't know if an author of a paper is a girl or a boy or a man or a woman, you don't know who the author of the paper is, what their gender is, you can just put they to refer to a singular author if you choose to. And this is to be a little bit more respectful because it's not always clear who the gender of the author is. So we want to be inclusive of that. The APA is really looking towards now becoming more social science oriented. And as such, there's no trying to pretend that you're not the author of the paper and that you're not the person doing the work. So you can use first person when you're talking about what you've done. If you're talking about your methodology or if you're talking about your organization, use first person to refer to yourself as that. However, third person is still the preference in the academic world, and you should use it whenever referring to others' work. You should always try to use it as much as possible in your work. Third person helps you from doing the things. This is why it was discouraged to use first person, is because when you use first person, you have a much stronger tendency to put your opinion into work. So I think that blah, blah, blah. Well, we don't care what you think. We care about what you've experienced. I've experienced this. That's a great statement. But I think we don't care what you think. We don't care what you feel. We don't care about your opinions on things. First person leads to opinionated writing. So try to avoid it as much as you can. But when you're clearly talking about something you've done, it is okay to use first person. And that's something important to know. Tables and figures are now formatted the same. Thank goodness. You don't have to try to format them differently. It's all the same. Once you learn how to do it, you will be golden for all of the things. Now, here's the one that kills me. I noticed Renata, her crosses the two periods, which I agree with too. But mine is, for years, I've told students, don't use quote marks to call out words. Use italics. That's what APA says. Well, now APA has changed its mind and it wants you to use quote marks to call out words instead of italics. Now, there are going to be times when you still use italics for defining words, but if you're just calling out a word, you can use quote marks for that now. So yay for that. But there are times that you will use italics, especially for defined words or for emphasis in certain situations. And the lovely APA manual will be much more clear on that, and they have several examples which are important. And I'll go over a couple of them when we're looking at the sample papers and whatnot. So here's a curve that I wasn't expecting, and this is an important note. Again, this is where APA is very much about details. And the thing that students and academics often make the mistake of is not understanding the importance of the details. And so one of these details is from now on, for books, use the copyright date and not the publication date. Now you might say to yourself, well, aren't those the same? And mostly they are. The example the APA manual gave is that if a book is published in December of 2019, but copyrighted in 2020, you would use the 2020 date in your references and not the 2019 publication date. The emphasis is moving away from the importance of publishers as being physical entities, because so many things are being published electronically that we no longer need to track down the publisher's city and state and the exact time that they published a book in order to find that book. Now, with the electronic world, with the Amazon, and with the way that we can find information, it's no longer as important. So the copyright date has become what's important. Now, that being said, as all good things APA related are, if you're looking at a website, for years I've told students the copyright date at the bottom of the website is the date you use. Don't use ND. Use the copyright date at the bottom of the website. Well, that's changed a little bit. You should use the copyright date of the website at the bottom. unless there's a date on the article or the web page that you're looking at. If you're reading an article or if you're looking at a CDC website and the information was published at a certain date, that's the date you use, not the copyright date, because those dates could be different. Again, for books, we no longer use the publishing location because a lot of publishing is electronic. So we don't care if it's published in New York or Massachusetts. And honestly, it was really annoying because publishers were now listing 5 or 6 locations. So how do you know which location to use? So now we don't. We're just using the publisher's name for books. We do not use the location of the publisher. Here's an exciting one for all of you who are have been working on dissertations and have been struggling to get your tables onto one page. Tables can now cross pages in an academic document. Before, it was discouraged. It was allowed, but it was discouraged. Well, now it is okay. You just repeat the headings of the table on the next page. Another thing is, for the most part, retrieve from has gone to the wayside. It's very rare now that you will use retrieve from in any kind of referencing. There are specific times when you may need to use retrieve from, but for the most part, you will not need to use retrieve from. So that's a good thing. Simplification, I guess. Here's another thing that makes things simplified. APA used to have weird times when you bolded things and when you didn't bold things. Now everything's bold. So you bold the abstract, you bold appendices, you bold references, and you even bold the introduction to the paper. So the title at the beginning of the paper used to not be bold, it's bold now. So that's something to look at. APA also understands that a lot of people who use APA are students. Students aren't submitting papers for publication, and they may never submit papers for publication. Therefore, why are they following the standard for publication instead of actually just doing a student paper? So APA has created 2 different standards, a professional standard and a student paper standard. Now, in our master's programs, you're going to be held to the student paper standard, at least in my programs. In the doctoral level, you may have times when your professor is going to want you to write in a more formal way, and they will let you know that. For the EDD, I can't speak for the DBA, but I'm going to unmute Dr. Price in case he wants to speak for the DBA. In the EDD, we are no longer going to require you to do an abstract unless the assignment says do the abstract. So abstracts are not required for student papers, but if the assignment says do the abstract, then you need to do one. It's good practice for writing and publishing, but it's not necessary all the time. So unless there's clearly in the assignment, it says an abstract is required, you are not required to do that. Dr. Price, do you agree for the DBA? Do you have a different standard?
No, Presley, the way that that you have described that there is exactly the way that I would approach it as well. So abstracts are very good to practice writing. However, you know, papers may not necessarily be long enough to have a very good abstract. And so, yeah, I'm following the rule of probably not going with abstracts unless unless the assignment clearly calls for it.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, so that's the deal with that. Moving on. Oh, sorry. Okay, we're moving on. There we go. Okay, so here's some things about citations. Citations have been simplified now. For citations, if there are more than 2 authors, you immediately can use et al. This means that from the beginning of the citation, the first time you use it, you can use et al. If it's 3 or more authors. If it's 2 authors, you still need to list both of the authors. 3 or more, you can use et al. From the beginning. There's no need to list those authors out. Now, this is helpful because it keeps you from having to do long and long citations. This is making the work more readable because you're no longer listing multiple authors. It used to be you'd list authors up to 5. So this is much more helpful in that way. If you are an academic, you may note that this means that if you're the second author of a 3-author paper, you are no longer actually going to be displayed. So in some ways it's great. In some ways now being first author has become a lot more important for some academic work. Now on the downside, it used to be that you did not need to, in the reference list more than, oh, Dr. Ferry, you're going to have to help me with this one. More than how many was APA 6.0?
Sorry, I'm here, but my dogs just barked. Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. How many, for the APA 6.0, how many authors did you need to list before you could use the ...
I want to say it was like 6 or something like that.
I think it was 6 too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you could list 6 authors and you could use ... Well, now with APA 7.0, you need to list up to 20 authors. So this doesn't really happen in social science, but in the hard sciences like chemistry and such, you might have 20 or 30 authors on a paper. That's more standard in the hard sciences. So in those ways, you would definitely need you may definitely run into a point where you have 20 or more authors. But what that does mean is that you need to list all the authors up to 20. So if you have 5 authors, if you have 10 authors, you're going to have to list all of them in the references. But in the citations, you don't have to worry about all that. Okay, so DOIs. Oh my goodness. We've had a multicolored storied history of DOIs and persistent links and all the things like that. Well, APA has tried to make it easier, and from now on, they understand that hyperlinks are something that happen naturally and can aid someone reading a paper to be able to find the work that's being referenced. So from here on out, you list the DOI as a website, and you can see the 2 differences here in the example. And you can hyperlink that, or you don't have to, but it's okay for it to be hyperlinked. We also no longer list retrieve from before that hyperlink. So it is just the hyperlink, just that URL. You do want to get a DOI number for all of your resources that it exists for. I mean, that's really important when you get further on and you're writing longer papers, because going back and trying to find the DOI numbers later is really difficult. Almost all work from the last 20 years has a DOI number. So you should make sure that you pull that whenever you're getting your references, if it doesn't come over naturally. Oh, and if you have a question, please type it in as we're going along. We're going to have time for questions at the end as well, but if you have a question as I'm going, I tend to talk kind of fast. So if you have a question as we go along, please type it in and we'll grab it, or ask to speak, which you're welcome to do. Okay. Now, here's one. We used to somewhat discourage serial references. And what that meant is stringing together a bunch of references at the end of a statement. She may say, oh, the sky is blue. Here are all the people that said that. What we found is students tended to do that to show the breadth of what they had read or experienced. And authors tend to do that as well. And that's fine, but the truth is that you do want to limit those usage. But now APA has made it very clear that when you do a stringing citation or a multiple citation, you want to make sure that you make it clear that you are referencing people who have talked about it. Again, this goes back to context. And we've talked a lot about the use of context in your writing to let the reader know what you're doing. So when you say multiple authors have found something, you're going to need to list those authors, or at least a sample of the main authors in that field that have said that. You can't just say multiple authors have found it and put a period at the end of that sentence. You know, we will never allow that. But for now, APA is saying you should put C and E period G period in the parentheses first, and then list the authors. What you're telling the reader is, if they want to learn more about this concept that multiple authors have talked about, they can see these different citations. So that's a little change, is small. I have heard from people that it was common before to use E period, G period, but it seemed to be, from what I read, that they want you to use the C, E, G. But, the point is to provide the context to let you know that you're sharing, that these authors all, and this is important, all of these authors share the same idea that you're discussing. Not that they maybe mention something about the idea, but the exact idea that you're saying. So in this sentence, is the sky is blue. Every single author I've listed has said in their article, the sky is blue. Oh, sorry about that. So that's the important distinction here. You want to make sure that all the authors actually share the same idea if you're going to note them in a multiple reference. Okay, so headings. If you're using headings, you want to, you're going to notice there's some changes here. In most work, you're never going to use more than the third level heading. It's really rare that you would get down to the further headings. And APA realized that, and they have made it so that the headings are a little bit more clear now. So as such, the heading 1 is still going to be the same, bold and centered. Heading 2 is going to be left justified, capitalized, and bold. Heading 3 used to be indented and the paragraph started after heading 3. We're not doing that anymore. Instead, heading 3 is now going to be left justified, capitalized, and italicized. So you can see here on the bottom example that heading 3 is now different. Now those are going to be the main headings you're going to use in your work. If you needed to get further down, if you needed to drill down further and you had the room for it, you can use heading 4, which was similar to the old heading 3, except heading 4 is still all capitalized for each word, and bold, and starts the new sentence. Okay, we got some questions coming in. We'll go back.
Yeah, Dr. Rankin, I think there's just some confusion around the C and the EG, which you and I talked about the other day. So can you talk about what you saw in the manual?
You must use, not must not use. I'm sorry about that. That was the typo. You must use CEG in the parentheses. So that's what you must do. Sorry about that. I do not know what page it is in the manual at this point, but I will find that out and let you know. Did that answer everyone's questions? Wonderful. Okay. Okay, now, it used to be that if you had page numbers for a journal article, you didn't list the issue number. Now, APA 7.0, you always include the issue number for journal articles. This, to me, is one of the things that I saw noted in many different websites that talked about the changes. I always thought you included the issue number no matter what. So for me, it was new information. So that's great. But for now on, you will always include the issue number for journal articles if they have one. And just remember that you just list the publisher name for book references. You do not list the city and state anymore. And now, as such, here's example of new journal entries, or APA references. You can see that they're cleaned up a bit. Still the same information. However, what I call zone 4, if you've ever seen my general APA video, I break down the zones into, like, zone 1 is the author, zone 2 is the year, 3 is the title, and then 4 is the information about how can I find this. So that's zone 4. So they've cleaned up zone 4. And what that means is that you've got it much more simplified. Instead of saying retrieve from, you just put the DOI number. You don't need to list websites unless the article is a web article that doesn't have a DOI number, then you would list the website. You list the issue number even if there are pages for the journal article. For books, it's much more cleaned up. You literally just list the publisher. No longer do you list the city and state. Now, that being said, of course, APA has to do a little twist because they don't want you to get away with having things too simple. If there are multiple publishers for a book, you list all of the publishers. It used to be you would just list the first publisher. Now you list all of them, and you put a semicolon between their names, and you list them all out. And when you're finished, you put a period. So multiple publishers do get listed for books now. If, for example, a book was originally a Penguin book and then it was published by another company and they share the publishing credentials in the first page of the book, then you want to list both of those publishers. Okay, so before we go to look at a student paper, I just want to pause. So I've been gabbing at you for 30 minutes. Any questions that have come up for you that we haven't answered already?
Presley, I'll just jump in really quick. I looked more into the C, comma situation.
Yes.
And yeah, like it seems like there's a little bit of flexibility in that. So you can say C also, and then the E dot G dot situation, you can just say EG, or you can say IE, or if they're very specific to the reference, you can say just the string citation. But the thing I think that's important is that, like, now it's very clear that APA 7 welcomes a string citation for references if you have like a sentence where multiple people agree with the statement that you've made. And it also just, I think, shows like that you've read well into your topic. So there is a little bit of variation on that, but you want to kind of say like C and then list those references, or C also, or the IE or the EG, just kind of initiates that like these people have also said that, versus just saying like this is what those people exactly said when you add that kind of C or IE or EG.
That makes a good point. And again, that goes back to, you want to represent the author and you don't want to put words in the author's mouth. So if an author has said something and it's not exactly what you're saying they said, but it's similar, or it supports what it's saying, or it mentions it, but it wasn't the focus of their article, then you'd want to add the C examples of, e.g., CEG, or C also. But if it is exactly the point you're making, and several authors have made that exact point, then you could just list them as a citation. Thank you, Dr. Ferry. That clears that up for me very much.
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, I see the comments kind of coming in, so like I'll have you touch a little bit more on the heading levels, but just to answer Dr. Cathcart's question, so in APA 7, there's no longer that like you actually have to type the word running head, colon, and then the title. Instead, particularly on student papers, it's just that you list the page number, and you'll see too that in the dissertation template, there's no longer a place where you list like the title up in the running header. It's just the page number. And then as far as David Shelby's question about the article month and day, you do that if it's like a website or a newspaper article. You don't do that if it's a journal article typically. So, but Presley, I'll let you talk about the headings.
Sure. That's great. No, all good questions. And it's exactly right. The idea is that we're having simplification here. So for student papers, you do not need a running head. For professional papers, you do need a running head, but you will not use the word running head anymore. That's an old thing from publishing that we no longer need in the new modern era. Okay, so I'm sensing that headings are a little confusing, so I'm going to table this until we get into the student paper example. So I think that will help you all understand that a little bit more. But if it's still unclear after I go through the student paper, please bring that back up and we'll talk about it again. Is that all right for everyone? Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's look at a student paper. Ooh. Okay, so when I was preparing for this talk, I do what all good doctoral researchers do, and I went on Google and I typed in, what are the changes between APA 7.0 and APA 6.0? And I found a lot of resources. And this is where what you'll learn as you become researchers is that you will learn that not all articles are, not all the things you find on a Google search are good. So you have to evaluate where they came from and how much that source is trusted. So this student paper that we're looking at came from the OWL at Purdue, and it's an expanded version of the student paper that's included in the APA manual. And I think it's a little bit more clear. And I believe that I can upload the paper to the webinar, and I will do that and make sure that you have examples. If I can't do that, or if something comes up, then I will be glad to upload that up for you later, or email it to everyone. But this student paper came from Purdue, and it's very good, though I didn't trust it 100% because you should never really just trust something. So I sent it to Dr. Ferry. She did find a few small errors, but none of the green or blue boxes that are pointing out things were an error. It was more of an error in using ellipses. So I think we're going to ignore that for now, but just know that not everything's perfect. I also found, and I hope you can see this change, is I found from APA itself just an overview of the changes, and we're going to go over that as well. Some of the things I wanted to point out about the new style. That came from APA Style Blog, which is the APA kind of official thingamajiggy. So, so that is something to keep in mind. I also found this comparison of, and this came from the University of Auckland, and this is an example of some things just aren't right. So this one says that you can use New Times Roman 11 as a font choice. That's not true. You can use New Times Roman 12. So there are a few mistakes in this one. So you could tell it was kind of thrown together at the very end and wasn't exactly, how do you say, perfect. So that's something to note, that you always have to be really good. Even from academic sources, you can sometimes get things that don't work. So this is a student paper, and this is the paper that you're going to most often be using for your course assignments. In the master's program and the doctoral programs, this is an example of a student paper. Now, for the dissertation, you won't use the APA example of a professional paper either. There's going to be some changes that are dissertation specific, and Dr. Ferry is going to be hosting a webinar about the dissertation and the APA 7.0. For the most part, it's the same, but there are some differences in the way that we format our dissertations, and that's typical for most universities. So I'm not going to read all of these boxes to you. Again, I'll make this available for everyone, but the bottom line is that the main title page for student papers has a page number on it, does not have a running head, and is much more simplified. You're not going to have keywords. You're not going to have anything like that. You're also not going to have an author's note. Now, for an abstract, you may or may not be required. It will depend on what your professor tells you. But for the most part, in student papers, abstract aren't required. But this gives you some very good information about abstracts. And one of the things it says, and this is important to note, is most abstracts do not contain citations. You should try to write your abstract in a way that it does not have to refer to other authors' work. However, should you actually have to, APA 7.0 is referencing that you just say the author's names without using a typical citation format. And this has been the same for some time. It's a preference. It doesn't mean that it's a rule, so keep that in mind. Abstracts are followed by keywords in professional papers. Again, this is not the same for student papers. You don't need any of this technically. Now, this is noting in this paper that once you get past this point, professional papers and student papers are pretty much the same. That's the truth. The title is listed as the beginning of the paper. You don't typically write introduction as a header. You would use actually the title of your paper again here. And it is assumed, or it is known, that what follows the title is the introduction. So you should never have a title on your first page and then go into depth on a topic. You need to introduce it first, and this is what you do here. Now, again, I'm not going to go into all of these small things, but you can see that there are examples here of how to use different things, including spelling out abbreviations when you first use them. The ampersand, everyone should know that if you're using authors in a sentence, you use the and. If you're using multiple authors, you use the in a citation, you use ampersand. But again, if it's two authors, you list them both. If it's more than two authors, you just use et al. The only time you'd want to use page numbers is if you're doing a direct quote. And we all know that it's better to limit direct quotes as much as possible. You can see here where they're using labels and they're talking about them. So they put quotes around them to call them out. That is something that is new.
Presley, can
Yeah,
I interject for just a second? Can
please.
you just scroll right back up to that page that you were on, and then stop right there? So just in terms of the ellipses, drama of 2020, just know that if you look at that sentence that starts by the mid 2000s, researchers had begun, blah, blah, blah. In APA 7, you don't need, so terms like parentheses, ... you don't need that ... to start a quote. That's absolutely not necessary. This is the only thing on this template I just want to point out that there's a discrepancy on. Everything else that Dr. Rankin is saying is correct, but that ellipses is not needed. Just start with the. And then when you want to indicate that there's a gap in the text, so let's say on page 56, they start by saying this, and then on page 57 they end with that worldwide comment, but like the point is pretty much the same. Then you use an ellipses, but you don't put it in brackets like they have here. You just do period, space, period, space, period, space. So it's like a spaced out ellipses, and that indicates a break in the text. Or if you happen to be interviewing people for your dissertation and we're on chapter 4 and you're going to put in their direct quote and they said something here and then later in the conversation they said another thing that relates, you would do that spaced ellipses once again. That signifies a break in the text. So that's the only kind of discrepancy that I saw when looking at this example. Everything else is totally on point, and this is a really good resource for students, but that was like sort of the ellipses controversy. So just to be clear.
That's where they messed up, is the ellipses, definitely.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. One of the things they point out here in this student paper is sometimes students may need to cite a secondary source. Now, we frown on this as professors in the program. We would rather you find the original source, but there are times when you're talking about, especially educational things, that you may actually want to cite an older source that you found in a source. So in this case, Pounder, 2007, cited Selden in 1993 about this issue. 86% of higher education institutes use SETs. So you can see how the new format for that would look. So as cited in Pounder 2017, you put the year from Selden. In the references, however, you would only reference Pounder. You do not reference Selden because that was not a reference of yours. You're using someone else's reference, and that's called a secondary citation. And you should try to avoid that whenever possible, but it is allowed. And so you should know that how to format it if you go down that road. Just remember things like that you want to use as little as possible. Again, sources with more than two authors, you would use et al. From the original source. You can see what that looks like. Now, here's our headings. So we know that heading 1 is centered and bold. Heading 2 then comes along and is to the left, capital K. Sentence is called sentence case. So you capitalize the first word of every word unless they're less, is it less than 4, Nicole, Dr. Ferry?
Sorry, I was in the comments commenting on people. Ask me the question again.
Is the, you capitalize a word that is 4 characters or
Correct.
more.
Correct. Yep.
That's correct. Okay.
Correct.
Good, good. Okay, so you capitalize anything that is 4 characters or more, and that would be a secondary heading. A third heading or a third level heading would then be the same thing, left justified, bold, and sentence case or capitalized all of every word that is more than 4, or every word that starts after a colon in this case. Then you start a new paragraph. Now, it used to be that you would have the paragraph start at the end of a third level heading. Now you do not do that. Actually, third level headings are left justified, and a new paragraph starts after that heading. Oh, hold on. That's a very good question. So Dr. Gerhardt asked the question of, can you actually have a heading above another heading without anything between it? APA does not have any issue with that. I personally think that you should introduce a the heading when you use it the first time. So there should have been a little introductory text between these two, and then you go into the third level heading.
Dr. Rankin, I'll jump in too that
Jump in.
APA 6 had a problem with that, and somehow APA 7 doesn't. So APA 6 used to require that there be text between 2 headings, and APA 7 doesn't. But I do think that Dr. Rankin is right in terms of like coming to preference for some people. I think that there's going to be a little bit of a transition there. But
yeah, and the thing is you'll always want to defer, of course, to your professor's style when it comes to what they prefer. But it's not wrong if you do this, and that's important to note. But it's not necessarily the best writing for the reader either, because I don't know about the rest of you, but when I look at this, I'm thinking it needs more, and I can see Patricia says the same thing. You would need more for the flow, and I agree completely. But that's something to know. And then this is a level 4 heading. So a level 4 heading is going to be what the level 3 heading used to be. Now, the difference, and you can't really see it here with this level 4 heading, is that the each word is capitalized. But since this is a hyphenated word, they didn't capitalize the second word, but each word would be capitalized, and then the sentence would start immediately after it. So that's now a level 4 heading. Again, headings are designed to be the guide for the reader throughout a paper. Headings should orient the reader to what's going to be talked about next and what the flow of the document is. If it's a short document, you probably don't need anything more than level 1 headings. If it's a longer document, say 8 to 10 pages, you may have a level 2 heading. It's unlikely that you're going to ever reach a level 4 heading. It would be a very, very long paper, or a very complex paper that needed the reader to be heavily guided through it, because that's what headings are, as guides. So if the reader needed to be guided very, very heavily, then you might get down to a level 4 heading. But again, it's unlikely in most of the writing that we do that you would get down to that level. Let's keep going. There was another thing I wanted to point out, because here it is. What's important often in, we talk about using context. And many of you have been trained to say, in an article by blah, 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 about blah, 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 this is what the author said. That's a little bit stilted. It's a good practice to get into to introduce your work, but there are better ways. The main thing that's important is that we know why you're using the work you're using. This sentence here is a great example of using context. So this author is now telling us, the reader, the best introduction to the research that serves as the basis for this claim is probably Neath, 1996, who performs something of a meta-analysis by presenting blah, 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 blah. The best introduction. They're telling us it's the best in their opinion. We know this is an opinion because if you use the word best, it's definitely an opinion. But they're saying that they're telling me why are they using this person. And this person is used a lot in this next section. So it's important that we know why this person is being used and why they were brought in. So that's good to know. Let's see. We have an example further, and I'm not going over everything because, you know, we don't have 9 hours to have this webinar. Okay, so figures and tables, they are now formatted the same, which is great. They are also, and this is a small thing that I've always hated, it used to be that these like small titles and things were in a different font size, and it just got confusing. So now it's pretty much you type the figure name, and figures are numbered sequentially. If you're doing a dissertation, you also add a point to that. So if you're in chapter 4, your figure would be 4.1. The next figure would be 4.2, 4.3. But if you don't have chapters of your work, then you just number them throughout the paper, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you put the title of the figure, then you have the figure, and then afterwards you have a note. Now, note is italicized, but the actual note itself is not, and that can be smaller. That can be a smaller font size than anything else. For figures, you will almost always have a note. For tables, notes are more optional. You still should have one to let the reader know what the table is about, but it's not as required. But figures are often a picture that has come from another person or from another place, and the note should talk about that or explain it in some way. You still want to follow the figure as close as possible to where you actually mention it in the text. So you should mention it in the text and then have the figure or table follow. Again, a table, same way. Here are the headings of the table, but this table crosses a page. Scandalous. Now, these headings are repeated, and that's what's important here, that the headings get repeated on the next page, because that is what's telling us about it, and then there's a note at the bottom of it. Again, we have some different examples of things. References are now bold. You have a list of references with some examples in this student paper, which is really great, very helpful. Appendices. Now, one of the things that APA 7.0 is doing is they're allowing the more expanded use of appendices. So if you don't want to put a table or a figure in the text itself, you may put it in the appendix. This has always been true, but now APA is kind of calling it out and saying you don't have to always put these things in the actual text itself. You can put it in an appendix. Appendices are labeled A, B, C, D, and each appendix should start a new page. It's important to note. Okay, any questions about the student paper? And again, I want to be able to upload it to the chat. I'm gonna see.
Can you stop there just
yes.
for a second? Again, I don't mean to drone on about APA, but if you've ever had my class, you know how much I love it. So let me just provide a few little reminders. You'll notice on that first citation, there's 2 authors and there's a comma from one author to the second author, right? So after that end period, there's a comma between 2 authors. Students often just kind of forget that because there's only 2 authors and you wouldn't necessarily do that in the in-text citation, but remember in the references, it needs to be there. I'd also just mention, as my dog's bark. Jeez. I have 2 dogs and I love them so much, but I'll just mention that the title, also notice that it is sentence case, and then you come with a capital after the colon. Okay, that's just another thing. And then now you can see also too that reference it, like links can now be hyperlinked. In APA 6, they could not be hyperlinked. In APA 7, they can. So that's another big change.
Yeah, and this is small. This is a small thing to add that won't come up for everybody. But if you're using something like the American Association of Professors and they're the author, you only list them once at the beginning. You do not need to list them for again as the publisher at the end. You just need to list them one time as the author and then go about the rest of the citation. Used to be you would reference them a second time, or you would say as author or something like that, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay.
Just to answer the one question that came up,
Yes.
they can be hyperlinked. I don't necessarily, from what I know, think that they must be hyperlinked. They can be, which used to be a non-option as far as I know.
Yeah. And I don't seem to be able to upload things to Zoom, so I will make these. I will just email these sample papers out to everyone who attended today, so that you have that. So we'll get that out. Okay. So what's new in APA? Can everybody see the APA style? What's new? Okay. Good. Thank you. Okay. So now this, I had a request from one of my students in my master's program, doctoral program. One of my current students wanted to a little bit understand how the manual is divided up and where the changes are in the manual. So this kind of goes over it. And I'm not going to go over everything here, but this document, and this is also in the beginning of the manual too, kind of tells you where are things. Chapter 1 is pretty much just an introduction, and that's what it features or focuses on. You can see in chapter 2 that we start going into elements of formatting, and you start learning about titles and things like that. And this is one thing that APA 7.0 is featuring, and I want to point this out to everyone because I'm sure, as all the faculty who are here tonight can testify to, you've had that student say, well, APA doesn't say that I have to do this, but it's clearly listed in the assignment that you do. Well, the students should always follow the guidelines of their instructor or the institution. That in mind, CityU is committed to stay as close to APA as possible, so you're not going to run into this very often. Just remember, though, that if the professor tells you they want you to do something, you need to do it. Those are the people grading your papers, and that's important. Important to note. The same is true if you're going to get published. You're going to be published. There are people who are going to review your paper, and they're going to have their opinions, and they can have some opinions, let me tell you. I've gotten a paper published recently, and it was just interesting to see the opinions that these people had. But that's the process, and we live with the process. It's called academia, for better or worse. So this is basically telling you the changes that have been made. Again, I will email this document out to everyone. I've highlighted a few things that I just wanted to note. I'm not going to go over everything. Again, it's important to know that the running head is not required on student papers unless the instructor asks for it. Tables can now be put at the end of the paper in the appendices instead of in the work itself. Abstracts are not required for student papers unless the instructor requires them. And here's one that I am much more excited about than Dr. Ferry is. You can now use different fonts according to APA, and you can see the APA suggestions of the fonts you use. And I'm gonna be clear about this. The reason these are suggested fonts is because of this line that you see on the next page. Fonts need to be accessible for students who have vision impairment, for students who have other issues with being able to see clearly. The fonts need to be clear to the reader. And the reason we've used Times New Roman is because your brain kind of gets trained to see a certain font and understand it. And Times New Roman was the font that almost everything printed was printed in. As such, your brain learns to read it very quickly. It doesn't have to learn a lot to read it. But it's a serif font, so it is a little bit dirtier on a screen when you're reading on a screen than a sans serif font, like Calibri or Arial or Lucens Unicode. But for the sake of my programs, the EDD, the Master of Leadership, Management and Leadership, and the Adult Education program, I really want to limit the use of fonts to fonts that are the same size. And 11-point Arial is the same size as 12-point New Times Roman. They're very compatible. So you could choose between those two in any of my programs. But the point that APA is making, oh, and the dissertation will still be Times New Roman. We're still going to stick with that just for consistency. But the point the APA is making is accessibility is what's important. And there's a link to a discussion about font accessibility that is really important to read and understand um, to really be inclusive in the work that you're doing. Now here's a new thing that you are going to see that you're going to see changes in my programs definitely is that the APA recommends using word count rather than page count to determine paper length. And this is important because APA again is going back and addressing students. They really want to make sure that you as a student understand that your paper may be different from other people's papers. So as such, we're going to use word count as the primary. We do list both on almost all the work we do, but page count is kind of going the way of the dinosaur, and word count is what is considered important. And word count includes table bodies, words in the text, references, that whole thing, figures, notes, appendices, and that's for larger work. And so it's important to note that. And you'll see that unless the professor tells you don't include title, page, and references, that might be the case. Again, the use of they, that's important. And here's an interesting thing that I just thought was cool. And I know we're at an hour now, so I'm going to stop talking in just a second and open the floor up for questions. But APA apparently has chosen Merriam-Webster.com as the dictionary of choice for all spelling. Otherwise, the APA Dictionary of Psychology would be your other choice. If there's an argument between the two, the APA Dictionary of Psychology, of course, wins out. But that's an important thing to note, that if you have a spelling issue, you want to know that the Merriam-Webster.com dictionary is where you should go to make sure you're spelling it properly. One space after period, we all know. Each chapter here is listed out of what's important, including some really interesting things that, people don't often turn to the APA manual for. But the APA manual also addresses appropriate levels of citation as well as plagiarism, self-plagiarism, or other unethical writing practices. So it includes talks about these topics, which I think are important because they give you a common language to talk about. Again, this is an example of that. We can now use American Psychological Association and not list anything else. In the old days, you would either have to list that they were the author of it or list them twice. We don't do that anymore. Here's a listing of 21 authors or more. You basically just put ... and then go to the last author. There are expanded guidelines for citing works in another language. When the issue is present, we've already gone over that. Now, there are going to be some journal articles that now have an electronic article number instead of a page range. If that's what they list, then you would list that as such. And that is, again, a small minor change, but you're going to want to use your APA manual to look up these examples. That's really what's important. Okay. Whew. 4:02. I think we started at 3:02, so I'm going to say that this has been an hour exactly. What questions does anyone have? And again, you could type your question in, or you can ask to have your microphone turned on, and I'll be glad to turn on your microphone. Any questions that have come up? If you don't have a question, you're welcome to sign out. And again, this recording will be available, and I will also send out all of the sample documents that I pulled for this webinar. Christy, I think what you're saying is that word count and page count tends to be the same thing. Typically, it's 350 words per page, but that's using New Times Roman font, double spaced. So as such, that's why we're using word counts as opposed to page counts from here on out, just so that you understand a little bit better about what it is we're asking for, no matter what font you use. And again, that's just kind of for the font thing. APA Gloria is becoming mandatory at CityU as of this summer. So you're going to want to start using it this summer. Obviously, we're going to have a grace period where we're going to be helping you to get a hang of it. But it officially started in the spring, but we weren't holding people to it. You could use either. This summer, we are going to expect everyone to use APA 7.0. Yes, David, only one period at the end of a sentence. No more using two periods. So we only use one period now at the end of the sentence. And Dr. Ferry answered that one. By chance, do you have the front page of a publication manual of the APA? I could show you what it looks like, Marco. Let me pull that up for you. Okay. Okay, Marco, you should be able to see the APA publication manual. It's a much nicer color this year. So we have some good color there. I would get the spiral bound version. That would be the one that I think is a better one. And thank you everyone for all of the good words. And we will be having more APA webinars, especially for the dissertation one that Dr. Ferry will be doing at some point. So we'll also include those. Yeah, and I think, Marco, this orange one, not the concise guide, is a much better one to get because it has all the examples in it. Just look for the spiral bound version of it. Thank you, Patricia. Definitely we need to do that. I think that this is very new, and so I didn't pull the page numbers into this presentation, but we will do that in the future to be sure that we have helped people to kind of navigate the manual better. That's a very good suggestion. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of your evening. Again, if you have any other further questions, please email me, and I will be getting out the copies of those PDFs tomorrow for everyone. And yes, please have a safe night, and yay. And Dr. Ferry is free for emails as well.